has such power in herself and in her story. And she was vital and insistent in her avowal of the importance of resistance and dissent under Trump. And it was very interesting in that first hour just how present Trump was. But also, Elaine, I think, created for us. There are no easy solutions in any of this. There's a messiness. It's difficult to organize dissent when so many elements are under assault. And then Elaine was followed by Paddy Gilmore and Sarah Wajeed, who challenged us to think about the nature of dissent itself and the power of the museum sector, but also the ways in which we can be confronted and might challenge our own biases. Sarah talked about the need for us to be unsettled as well as to unsettle the institutions in which we work. And Paddy talked about the cost to those who are dissenters and about the need to talk to people with whom we disagree. And both drew our attention to the fact that dissenters also need to work with those who know how to collaborate and build consensus. The cost of dissent was told in Laura Rekovich's enthralling discussion of the possibility of museums as sanctuaries, not escaping society, but in confronting its worst excesses. She talked about the myth of neutrality, which continues to powerfully sustain the status quo. So we set off to a variety of talks, charged, it seemed to me, to meditate on what dissent is, what constitutes a dissenter, how do we unravel the power and authority in museums and decide on their societal responsibilities, agency, and how might we understand dissent by and within the sector. And one of the things that struck me throughout the day was this sense of a sector, museums as a collective, but there must be dissent within the collective too. And I could see that in some of the panels. It's an interesting tension and necessary, I think. And then I went to two Irish panels, one exploring divided societies, which reflected on the decade of centenaries and showed that even when we collect a plurality of voices, the audience might still hear a singular story. But the role of museums in dispelling historical myths and creating constructive dissent is one that can give energy and purpose. The ability to create uncertainty about the past is a positive thing. Uncertainty was less positively experienced on the panel on the bridge over Brexit, in which one of the pressing questions was how political should museums be? Healthily, it seemed to me, there was no consensus on this. One question from the audience came from someone who had been at the Hot Topics session. And it was a reminder. I spent the whole day, sometimes I go to conferences and there are lots of panels, and I spend the whole day feeling I picked the wrong panel. But today, I was always happy in the panel I was in, but it was driving me crazy that I was missing. So somebody said, I've just come from the Hot Topics panel, and I was thinking, that sounds fantastic. And again, there was just this sense of the diversity and the multiplicity of voices. And this program is a banquet, I think, multiple feasts. There was a fascinating talk on curating post-colonial history and the questions. I have found the questions from the floor to be really good at pushing the conversation forward. And in that particular session, the conversations on the floor, from the floor, it seemed to me, interrogated the power dynamics of the sector. And it's clear people are really alert to the politics of that and to the power within museums. Space Invaders was a reminder of the sector itself as a problematic space. Nirmar Pawar, I'm sorry, I'm probably pronounced that wrong, reminded us of the remark by Winston Churchill, who said, I find a woman's intrusion in the House of Commons as embarrassing as if she burst into my bathroom and I had nothing to cover myself, not even a sponge. And she talked about the disorientation that people with a sense of entitlement and natural power feel when that is challenged. The exposure that Churchill feels intruded upon in the most intimate of ways. He feels vulnerable. And that opened up a really interesting discussion. And again, I think the spaces within the waterfront have been used really well. There were, lots of kind of breakout sessions and interactive sessions. And that one was also really an interesting discussion on women within the sector. And then that sense of power, I think, was also obvious in a discussion by Sam Evans on class in museums. So many of these topics intersect, and we got a great kind of sense of the significance of intersectionality. And everybody bringing together their experiences, their knowledge, and really trying to test this sector, I think, and see what its capacity is, what its potential is, while also having an understanding of its limitations, its biases, and its prejudices. And this, I think, when we think of its capacity, when we think of its potential, I think the Festival of Change is just such a great, provocative, disruptive, inspirational way for the museum sector to think about how to intervene in all of these kinds of debates. There's History Speak. If you haven't visited it yet, take the chance tomorrow. History Speak, a fascinating project, creating a database of textbooks from around the world in English and comparing the written histories and finding that embedded imperial language, the kinds of the racism, the prejudices, and just unmasking it in this database. So really interesting. A museum of femininity. And one of the longest queues I saw at the Vagina Museum, teaching good science by feeding people's curiosity. The Glasgow Women's Library, the Modified Monopoly Board, looking at social capital and that wonderful illustration of how that operates within museums. And that was again looked at by Sam Evans in her work on class. At the end of her talk, Sarah Wajid asked Sam, "Are there reasons to be cheerful?" And in some ways it was a question that hung over quite a few of the sessions, because when you look at power, sometimes it can feel overwhelming, that the system is so complicated and interconnected that to find a way through it without yourself becoming part of the problem is difficult. But it seemed to me that the whole day was a reason in some ways to be cheerful, because the right questions were being asked, and there were a multiplicity of voices, and there are lots of important things that museums can do to challenge and to protect and to be inquisitors of the society. So I look forward very much to tomorrow. Now, for the final section in the waterfront, it is my really great pleasure to introduce the poet and playwright Rita Ann Higgins. We share the same surname, but that's where our connection ends. It's a great surname, I have to say. And one of Rita Ann Higgins' great lines, I think, is, "For Christ's sake, learn to type and have something to fall back on." She's a poet with that kind of insistence and energy, and there's something vibrant and real. Rita Ann Higgins was born in Galway, one of 13 children, and she left school at 14. She began to write poetry in her 20s after having been hospitalized with tuberculosis. Rita Ann's work often tackles issues such as social inequality, and she combines passion, conviction, and wit. She's a great choice for a conference with the theme Dissent. Rita Ann has published 11 books of poetry, including Tonglish, Ireland is Changing Mother, and Throw in the Vowels, New and Selected Poems. She has recently written 2 short films in Irish. The poet Gerard Smith said in Poetry Ireland, "Higgins has always been a poet with a distinctive stance, never shirking her responsibilities as a public voice, speaking on behalf of those who do not possess such a platform. She is both jocular and jugular, 2 traits that combine